Welcome to my video. Today I'm going to show you how to do a 50-hour service, or also call it an air can service, on a Rockshock Ultimate Deluxe rear shock. But before we can start, we have to do some technical detail checkup. So let's jump to that. Okay, let's have a look at the technical detail before we start the service, because we will need a service kit. And to find the right service kit, I will use trailhead.rockshock.com. If you look at the picture with number 1, you will see 2 lines of number. The first line is our serial number for our rear shock. Okay, let's have a look at picture number 2. You can see there's write and enter serial number. So the number we found on picture 1, we put that in the search box down on the picture 2, and then push search by serial number. Okay, let's have a look at number 3 picture. Then I can see the picture of the rear shock is similar to that rear shock I will do the service on. In the right side of the picture you will see tuning, details, support and kits. And because we should do service on our rear shock, I will click at kits so I could find the right service kit for our rear shock. Then let's jump to picture number 4. Here you can see you can choose between service and upgrade, but we only should do service this time, so we push the bottom service. And here you will see that we can find 2 kind of service kits for our rear shock. There is the 200-hour service, also called the big service, and there is the 50-hour service, also called air can service or small service. We should only do the small service, so we choose the 15-hour service. And before we can find the service kit to buy it, I will use the number that stands under the text that tell me it's the service kit for 50-hour service. This is the way we find the right service kit for this rear shock. You can use this on all Rockshocks, forks or rear shocks. So now we have checked all our technical details so we could find the right service kit. I have the right service kit right here with me. I will turn back to that later. So now we can go through the service. Now we're ready to do the service part. But before we can start, we have to wear safety gloves. After we have taken our safety gloves on, we will check our air pressure in the rear shock, and we use a shock pump to do that. I have already done that. There was PSI inside the rear shock. So now we're ready to take our well cone out. To take out our well cone, I have my well cone tool here. The reason why we're taking our well cone out is to be sure there's nothing air inside the rear shock. After taking the well cone out, we are taking our air can off. It can be really tight. Now it's ready to be taken off. To be sure nothing happened to the air piston, we have to be safety while we're taking off, to not make any scratch. This is the air can. On the air can we have an O-ring right here, and we had the dust wiper, and the white one you can see inside here is a scratch ring, and there's also a sealing gasket under the scratch ring. Then we are taking off first. So this is the O-ring. And we have the dust wiper here. Make sure when you take it apart, you don't scratch anything. And here we have the scratch ring. It's the white one. It's an open ring. You can see it here. And here we have the sealing gasket. Now we have take all parts of the air can. Now we are ready to go to the next step. We are taking our counter measure off. This is the counter measure. And now you can see we have 2 right rings and we have a black one. You can also see the difference on the 2 right rings. That's very important to remember. So the thick one, this one, is the top scratch ring. And then we have this, the thin one is also a scratch ring. And then we have our sealing gasket, it's a big one. Again, make sure you don't scratch anything. This is the sealing gasket. Now we have to take all parts from each other. In a 50-hour service, or also called an air can service, we don't take the air piston from each other, only the air can and the sealings that belongs to the air can. So now we have to take everything apart. So we have to put everything back on again. Then we use our service kit I showed you earlier in the video. I have already done the service kit ready. When you do service on a shock, you have to be sure you use the right grease. To be sure it's the right grease, for this rear shock, they have already put it inside the service kit. The Rockshock Dynamic Seal Grease is for the sealing gasket and the scratch ring. And then we have our oil. You can see it in here a little bit. The oil we're putting inside the air can. We are putting the half of the oil on the one side and half of the oil on the other side. I will show that later. So now we are ready to put our air piston scratch ring and sealing gasket on. Then I take my top scratch ring, the thick one, and I put some grease on it. It's this. Just so it just have a little bit on. If this scratch ring is a little bit too big, you can push it through each other, this like this, to make it smaller. Then we put it on, and we knew when we took it off that the thick one should be in the top. Then I take my sealing gasket and also give it some grease to make sure it's not dry. It's not that good. So I put it on. And then I take our scratch ring, there's the thin one, and do the same. This can also be a little bit too big. You can see it here, it's a little big. So I take it off and give it a little squeeze to make it smaller. Then we put it on. And then I seal it with a little grease. Not too much and not too little. So. Like that, yes. Now we have put our scratch ring and our sealing gasket on our air piston. Now we have to do it on our air can. I take first the O-ring, it's a small one. I have it right here. And I have lots of grease on my fingers, on my gloves. So I just use the grease to put it on the O-ring. And then we put it on the air can. And then it's time for the bottom. Then we have our sealing gasket that also need grease. Before we put it in the air can. And then we have our scratch ring. That also need grease. That's one. And then we put it inside, and it can be really difficult to get it in. So just make sure you don't break anything. It was easy this time. You can see it inside here. Then it's time for our dust wiper. That's also need a little bit grease. That way. So now we're ready to put it together. Now we have gave our air can, the sealings, the scratch ring, the dust wiper. Now we put our countermeasure back on. You have it there. And then we have put our air can on. I use the half of the oil in the bottle inside the air can to get the oil in the negative air chamber. And then I take the other half of the oil and put it inside our positive air chamber. It can be a little bit easier to put the rear shock in this position. Now I have put the other half parts of the oil inside the air can. So now we can make it done. So I pull it together, push it together. It can be a little bit rough, and screw it tight. Now I have put the air can on, so we have to tighten it. But it's really dirty right now, so it can be really slippy. So I use some tool to tighten it, to be sure it's tight enough. Now we have made the 50-hour service, or also call it air can service. So now we have to check it that it's tight enough without glove, and it is. So we put our sec ring on. It's the new one. There wasn't one on from the start, so we put a new one on. Then we have our weld cone. We put back on to put some air inside the rear shock. Now we have put our weld cone inside the rear shock again. Then we put some air inside. From the start I was checked, I have 1 psi inside. It's the same for a rider, has a weight on 80 kilograms. So now we're putting air inside the Now we have done our 50-hour service, or also called an air can service, on our Rockshock Ultimate Deluxe rear shock. And I have put the air pressure back inside, so it's fit for a rider on 80 kilograms.